Hello and welcome back to JLXP after yet another day of World Quarterfinals. That's 3 quarterfinals in the books, and it is also the last Western team being eliminated from the World Championship. G2 falls to TES 3-1. They had done some interviews before the series with Romain, G2's general manager, and he was mentioning how they thought TES was the best draw for them, and TES thought G2 was the best draw for them as well. So both teams were kind of happy with this, and it ended, I'm reading comments online. People are pretty depressed about this G2 team. I'm going to get into that throughout this podcast. I have 9 thoughts that I'm going to talk about. First off, I'm going to kind of recap really these last 3 years for G2, but also talk about this series in general. And before I get too deep into the podcast, I apologize if there's a little extra sound today. They're jackhammering concrete next door. I tried to set up the filters on this microphone so that it wouldn't cut me off and also wouldn't sound super obnoxious for you. If you end up liking this video and you've liked the content I've been putting out, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. I also started a TikTok yesterday. I'm going to try and do daily TikToks when there's league. So it's Esports Jat over on TikTok. So going to try and grow a new social media platform, apparently. But without further ado, let's get into point 1, which I've talked about before. What does G2 and what has G2 done better than anyone else to close the gap between the East and the West? Because there was a Reddit thread that actually had an even more incredible stat than the ones that I've been mentioning on this channel about G2 compared to every other Western team in LEC or LTA. And this guy on Reddit said, since MSI 2019, 36 out of 37 series, best of 3 or best of 5s, with non-G2 teams have been lost. 36 of 37. G2 only won 5, and they lost a bunch of them, which makes it 6-51. And as I've talked about before, a bunch of games have been taken by teams like FlyQuest or Team Liquid. But in terms of actually getting it done, G2 is the only team that's been able to do it at all. And the way that they've done this, I'm going to re-hit something I touched on last year. I think there are 4 things that they do that they need to do to close the gap, just because the advantages of the Eastern teams are numerous, whether it's the massive solo queue player bases they have, the incredibly quality of the solo queue, or just the raw investment that the region is able to put into it, not to mention playing so many more games in their schedule. Like you can go on and on and on, but a lot of times G2 has found ways to overcome this, challenge, or beat these LCK and LPL teams. And I feel like they did it often through internal validation, which was like their great ability. Even though they had been at the very peak of their region, they were still able to understand what was good and bad, which is what a lot of teams struggle with when they have like 80-90% win rates in their league. And in scrims, they can't necessarily figure out what's good, and then they go on stage with something that has been smashing the lesser teams and doesn't work against the good teams. G2 hadn't really had those problems. This year, I'd say this G2 hasn't really done these 4 things that I'm going to be getting into. So in terms of internal validation, they didn't really need it this year because they were actively challenged. They made the roster change, and they kind of had to start over. In winter, they were 3rd place. In spring, they were 2nd place, and they didn't win the LEC until summer before going into Worlds. I think another thing that traditionally has been amazing for them is their fundamentals of the game, their matchup knowledge, as well as their tempo and macro. And I think this wasn't true today against TES. While they did match the macro at times, I thought they had borderline game-losing Otacon plays in both Game 3 and in Game 4. I'd say the one in Game 4 particularly is the one that stands out to most people. I think the timing of their Otacon take in Game 4 was correct. They actually had 2 completed items, core items, on top lane, AD carry, and then Caps recalled while they were doing the Otacon to also get 2 items. So they would have had an item advantage in like 3 rolls if they timed it like slightly better, but the overall thought of let's force a fight while we have item advantage was correct. But just the way they spread out throughout the Otacon, the way they didn't seem synced on when to engage, compared to what happened in Game 3 when TES took the Otacon, or even in Game 1 when TES took the Otacon, and just like started the Otacon, when G2 approached, they backed off. As they backed off, they placed a ward. They could teleport behind the ward. It just felt very professional, whereas the G2 Otacon play felt very disorganized. So the fundamentals, the macro knowledge, and the ability to play with tempo wasn't on display today for G2 either. I think something they've previously done against Eastern teams to make them have advantages is also their level 1 and their early game plans. Again, I think those were lacking for G2 today, not to mention Kanavi really dominated a lot of these early games, specifically his Nefiri versus Poppy game. He ran the Poppy off the map and made it so Skumon could not really do anything in that game on Poppy. I think their champion pool and their meta read is the other thing that has really made them exceptional. I still think that this was good in this series, but I'd say it has been better in the past. So those are the 4 things where G2 has traditionally found their edges to get over the hump against these Eastern teams. And I just don't think those things were necessarily as good today as they have been in the past, which is why we're sitting here with G2 being eliminated in 4 games to top esports. Second point, I want to talk about G2's 3-year run. I'm going to talk about the drafts in these series in more detail as the next point, but I just feel like this is the top of mind conversation, so I wanted to get to it first. So their 3-year run, it's still the best in the West. But I do think it's up for significant debate whether this version of G2 was better than 2023 or 2024. So I pulled a bunch of stats. I'm first just going to talk about G2 versus the East. I know it's an overgeneralization. I don't have the level of granularity for specifically exactly all the teams that they won and lost to try and determine like, oh, this was a worse record, but they were playing the number 1 seed versus the number 4 seed. It's all a little bit generalized, but bear with me. So this team, this 2025 G2 team, their record against the LCK LPL is a combined 3-10. Game score, 23% win rate. That past iteration in 23-24, adding everything up, they played 32 games against the East. They were 12-20 for a 37.5% win rate, which is the best win rate that anyone has had against them other than the 2019-2020 version of G2. And for comparison, what I talked about in my FlyQuest episode, FlyQuest, with their current roster that is going to be changing, as we've already seen on social media, was 6-15 for a 28% win rate. So 2023, 2024 G2, 37.5. FlyQuest 28.6, this G2 23. So I'm going to list more stuff because there's multiple things to compare with. How good were you against your peers and how good were you against the East? So quick recap of the last 3 years of G2. In 2023, they won the winter split, they were 4th in spring, they won the summer split, and they won the season finals, which was kind of an extension of summer split, but it was the season finals. I'm going to call it 4 splits. They won 3 of 4. At MSI, they lost to Genji 3-1, BOG 3-1, and they 3-0'd MAD in between. So it was kind of a wasted tournament. That was before they had the MSI rules about inter-regional draws, so it was not very fun for the West. At Worlds that year, they had really hard opponents, but they did decently. They played D+, Weibo, Genji, Energy, and BLG in group stage. So 4 Eastern teams and Energy. And yes, they got memed on for losing to Energy, and that was the pride of North America that we've held over Europe for 2 years. But that Worlds, they did beat D+ and Weibo, and they took a game off of BLG. So overall, I would say that team had a pretty good World showing in terms of quality of opponents that they beat, even if they didn't actually advance out of Swiss stage to the quarterfinals. Fast forward to 2024. The domestic dominance improved. They won winter, spring, summer, and season. The most dominant you could possibly be. At MSI, in first round, they lost to T1, but they went to 5 games, 3-2. They then swept PSG. They swept TES before losing to T1, 3-0. So not amazing, but holy crap, that's 5 game wins against the East. That's nearly beating T1, and that's sweeping TES. At Worlds, they beat Pain, they lost to HLE, they beat Weibo, they lost to T1, and then they lost to BLG again, 1-2. But that's still 2 more game wins against the East. So, that run from G2, 23-24, that team was really good. They never got over the hump, which still makes me say that it is the correct decision to switch something up because the scar tissue collectively from that team, with the pressure they put on themselves and the expectations they have to never make it to World's quarterfinals as that final goal, was too much, so they needed a bit of a reset. However, that reset comes with costs. So 2025, third in winter, second in spring, first in summer. Their worst domestic performance in 3 years. At MSI, they barely make it through play-ins. They go to 5 games against Furia and GAM. They lose to Gen.G 3-1, and then they get swept by FlyQuest, which was, I think, like a low watermark for this iteration of G2. But here at Worlds, they lose to TES, they beat Koi, they beat BLG, they qualify off of FlyQuest this time instead of losing to Energy like they did in 2023, and then they here lose to TES 3-1. So if you followed along, I kind of think that domestically in the last 3 years, this was the worst version of G2. I think in terms of quality of opponents that they were able to beat, this is the arguably worst of the 3. But in terms of actually breaking through to quarterfinals, that's where they're successful. And a lot of that does come down to luck. So I don't really know where G2 goes from here. We know that they are, to me, definitively the best team in the West across the last 3 years. This is also just the first year of this combination of players trying to work together. But there's a lot of big names floating around in the offseason. And either click on the timestamp where I'm going to talk about the offseason, or stick around through the rest of the podcast, because that's going to be point number 9 as I'm going to start doing some offseason speculation. But I'm going to get back to this series for a second. The drafts in this series. G2 had side select this series. And they decided to pick red side in game 1, which I think was a little bit weird based on what ended up happening. So I'm going to cover all 4 drafts fairly quickly. Game 1, TES had Ambessa, Wukong, Akali, Varus, Braum. Pretty standard. It was the first pick Wukong. The Akali was a counter pick into the Orianna on the other side, and it was a dive comp. G2 picked Cassante, Xin, Orianna, Corki, and Rel. But, like, if you're going to pick red side, I was expecting something a little bit surprising. Like, we know the blue side team is going to pick, like, Wukong first. What is your answer into Wukong? If I'm speculating, maybe they were thinking that there was going to be like Sion Trundle as part of this draft, but the blue side Trundle ban by TES might have thrown them off, because I personally think that Ivern into Trundle, as we saw later in the series with compositions that didn't really match the Ivern, is like a checkmate type draft if you can pull it off correctly. But then when the blue side Trundle ban came in from TES, maybe they got thrown off a bit. Kobe made a good point in the cast as well, that like, even if you're going to be creative, a lot of times it is best in game 1 to just pick generic stuff to get it all off the table, and then your creativity can come through later in the Fearless draft. But I just feel like if you're in game 1 of a series, just pick blue side. I think red side increases in power as Fearless gets later. So that was a little bit weird to me. Game 2 draft is the only game that G2 won. I don't even feel like Mundo is that favored for them in game 2, but they're really good at it. And then Hans Sama and Lebrov played awesome on Lucian and Bard, but Hong had a really bad Alistar game. So the team compositions in game 2 were Rumble, Kiana, Yone, Sivir, Alistar, flashy, divey, team fighty. And then G2 had Galio, Mundo, Ryze, Lucian, Braum, which is like, I think I heard Vedius right after the draft being like, I don't like this. But it ended up working, I think, mostly through their play. They were absolutely able to decimate the Sivir, Alistar bottom lane. I think TES could have played a lot better in this game. I think the Kiana, despite losing, is just so good. Kanavi's Kiana is nasty. That's something that I think, if you don't play Kiana yourself, I never want to play against that thing. G2 managed to outscale it with the Mundo. There was definitely some fights later in the game where TES, I think, thought they could kill the Mundo, but I don't think had that many games against it, so they just overcommitted and lost a bunch of bodies. But yeah, this was just, to me, a straight-out outplay by G2. I don't actually think it was an outdraft, aside from the surprise of the Mundo. Game 3 is the really interesting one to me. So this was Aatrox, Trundle, Hui, Ezreal, Karma for TES. And it was Renekton, Ivern, Silas, Caitlyn, Thresh for G2. And I absolutely love Ivern into Trundle. And this is going back a bit, but I think the fundamentals of the matchup were still the same. In 2020 on TL, Broxa mainly played Graves, Lee Sin, and occasionally we'd be slamming the Trundle. But when we played against FlyQuest, Santorin played Trundle and Ivern, and we didn't play Ivern. And that just gave us handcuffs in draft because he could play Trundle, and we didn't have a good answer for it because they'd ban the Lee Sin. And if we wanted to play Trundle, he would answer with Ivern, and we just felt like that was unplayable. Because at the time, both of us just played scaling teamfight comps, and Ivern just is better in those situations. So, to me, G2 got a little too fancy with their Ivern counter, and I would have liked to see them just pick more scaling team fighting. So rather than try and Silas into Hwei, I think they should have just played a control mage. And then I feel like Thresh is also a little bit too flashy. Just give me an engage support. Or just pick the Draven right away when you pick the Ivern, because the Ivern can protect the Draven. If they're willing to slam Draven in Game 4, they should have been willing to slam it in Game 3, in my opinion. So I loved the Ivern. I didn't love the team comp that G2 played with it in Game 3. Game 4, they ended up playing the Draven early. They tried to snowball the game early. Kind of a strange draft. Ornn, Poppy, Sivir, Draven, and Nico versus Nara, Naafiri, Victor, Xayah, and Rakan. The Draven Nico really should dominate this game. But I think the Poppy getting set behind by Naafiri made G2 not play quite as fast as they wanted to, and then they had that throw out the Otacon, and that's the end of the series. So drafting wasn't as big of an advantage for G2 as I thought it could be in this series, is the TLDR. Point number 4, I think TES is a really good early game team, by the way. Coming into this, even though they were 4 wins, 5 losses in game score from Swiss Stage, they averaged plus 1,000 gold at 15. And they kind of play all the meta stuff, so they're very flexible in draft. Interestingly enough, in this series, they were 1,000 gold, 1,100 gold up in Game 1. Game 2, they were down 700 gold. Game 3, they were down 280 gold. And Game 4, they were down 119 gold. So G2 neutralized TES's really strong early game pretty well overall. Part of that through draft, part of that through play. But they were definitely matching them mechanically in lane phase. That wasn't the problem in the series. And I think that early game strength from TES might carry through for the rest of Worlds. Turns out that was a pretty quick point. Point number 5 that I have. The TES international chokers, if I look at that, and bear with me here, it just goes to show the difference of expectations between these teams. Like, if I look at their Worlds results and just don't say that, like, they are an LPL team that must succeed, and I say, just imagine TES as an LCS team, right? Or an LEC team. The results don't look that bad. 2020, top goes to semifinals. 2022, they lose in group stage. Hey, it happens. It happens to the best of us. 2024, they go to quarterfinals. Not bad, right? And now 2025, another World semifinal, right? Obviously, they are an LPL team, and their expectations are very high. But my next point, number 6, is I don't feel like they're going to choke from here on out. I looked at their cameras right after they won, beating G2. They did not care. They were not necessarily relieved. They were not necessarily that excited. They probably expected to win and were a little bit relieved that they didn't lose. But now I feel like, depending on what happens tomorrow in AL versus T1, if they play against AL, I think it's a comfort zone for TES. This is a team that is domestically a lot better than they've shown internationally. And even as recent as the summer playoffs, they beat AL 3-1 before losing in finals to BLG. But they beat AL 3-1 in the lower bracket of the LPL playoffs. In Split 1, they qualified by beating AL 3-1 in the finals. Split 2, TES tilted off the face of the map, was like 6th or something. Didn't even lose to these teams. And they've already eliminated BLG at Worlds so far. So I feel like they'll be comfort zone if they play up against AL. And even though T1 has this insane aura, I feel like because of them being back-to-back world champions, TES will definitively go in as an underdog. Even if they're the last hope of the LPL and T1 is this unstoppable force, I think like being the underdog in that situation is a little bit freeing. So I'm not sure. I think the T1 draw is definitely worse because there's the pressure of being the last LPL team against the sea of Korean teams that are still there. But I think for a team that has been dumped on by their own fans so often for failing internationally, like the fear of doing it again isn't as bad, especially if they're not doing it against a team that they should beat, right? The upside is so insane for them if they can take down T1 and then eventually Gen G or KT in the finals. Whereas the downside is like, oh, we lost to T1 like every LPL team has done for the last 3 years. Like you're not going to get shit on for that. So I think the pressure shifts for TES from here on out. And I'm not shocked if they go to finals. I also think Kanavi, he might be the best jungler at the tournament. He's definitely the best early game jungler that I've seen in this tournament. But like his Kiana especially is just very overpowered. I think Kiana as a champion must just be overpowered. There was this moment in the G2 game today where the Alistair Kiana moved top lane. Kiana's a level down into Caps' Rise. And like there was literally just nothing Caps could do. He just accepted his fate and died. And I was thinking that there aren't other junglers that can do this to Rise, just straight up. Not to mention his team fighting is great. It's just an incredibly hard champion to play. I remember I was on the design team when this champion was being made, and I was actually the live designer who was supposed to help balance this champ. And I was just too bad at the champion. Like I played probably 50 to 100 games on it, and I could never do the good things. And I was giving the feedback to the champion designer. I'm like, I know that I can't play this champion. And some people just can, and it unlocks something incredibly new. There's just something about the way you have to maneuver and dance your cues. And when you're comboing correctly, the burst is so absolutely absurd. But if you miss one thing or have the wrong blade at the wrong time, you're just useless. And I feel like Kanavi has really unlocked that champion in an insane way. Okay, point number 8. With the teams that are left at Worlds, traditionally, I don't feel like you've needed to be a perfect team to win Worlds, but that might be different now that Fearless Draft exists. So a couple of old school examples. I feel like 2018 IG was an imperfect team, but they did one thing really well. They played really, really level 2 Scuttle Crab flippy junglers well, and their solo laners absolutely dominated you. And that was it. Like, it didn't matter. Like, they didn't play 5v5 scaling team fighting. They didn't need to know how to do that. They just needed to know how to slam you in lane and then snowball quickly from there. 2019 FPX, they had Doinby mid playing Nautilus and stuff. Akali was the biggest pick at that World Championship. They didn't play a single game of Akali. So they had imperfect champion pools. Gimgoon in their top laner was basically just weak side every single game. But they were experts at their one thing, and that led to their World Championship. I'd even say T1 in 2023 struggled through Swiss stage, but then once Keria and Guma started abusing range supports, kind of took over the tournament. And I think there used to be a way that you could kind of checkmate people in draft, and then they wouldn't have a counter for it. So I'd already alluded to like my personal example of 2020 FlyQuest versus 2020 TL, where just because they had this like jungle trifecta in their favor and they played this one champion, that gave us a huge disadvantage in draft against them. But if that happens now, it's like, sure, let's just pick Trundle Ivern. Let's pick Trundle in game 1 and see if we can beat the Ivern. Like maybe it's 70%, but then we're free. Then we're free for the rest of Worlds. We're free for the rest of the series. So as exciting as Fearless is to watch, and as much as I do think it should stay, I do think it changes how deep you need to be as a team. So maybe you do need to be a perfect team to win Worlds. And maybe this means Gen G is actually completely destined to win. Funnily enough, I was looking back at Gen G's the last 2 years. Okay, I just added an extra point. I have 10 points. This is point 9. I just think Gen G's an even bigger favorite to win Worlds now, because I was looking at their MSIs. MSI's this double elimination best of 5 tournament, and G2's won it, or Gen G has won it 2 years in a row. They haven't even needed the lower bracket. They've just won from the upper bracket both times. Aside from losing to T1 in semifinals of Worlds last year, this team would be on such an insane run. And if they win Worlds this year, it'll be 2 MSIs and 1 of 2 Worlds, which is like definitively the era of Chovy and Gen G. We're not there yet. They really need the Worlds. Otherwise, it just doesn't count. Like, who cares about 2 MSIs without a Worlds? But they are... Everything seems to be lining up for Gen G. Let's put it that way. Okay. 25 minutes in. Last point. Going big picture. Off-season stuff. Starting with G2, honestly. Do they run it back? We just talked about their 3-year run and how if you look at the whole picture, I think this year was worse than the last 2 years before it. But at the same time, like, if you're going to invest in this new jungler who just got experience in Skewmond, I think Labrov played pretty well. You could absolutely run it back and still have good results and probably still be the best team in the West. But they clearly want more. And there are some big names. So I was looking at the Riot Global Contract Database, and these are the players whose contracts officially end in 2025. Inspired, Busio, Whippo, Core JJ, Caps, and Quid. It's a lot of names. So the biggest, to me, the biggest chip, actually, everyone's been talking about, like, oh, where's Inspired going to go? Where's Inspired going to go? Where's Inspired going to go? Is Caps going to re-sign with G2? That's the big thing that could throw a curveball. And I'm not a behind-the-scenes gossip guy. I know nothing about this other than what Sheep Esports has tweeted or said on Reddit. But I'm just thinking about the way these players interact with each other, right? Inspired. I want to talk about Inspired for a sec. He is really, really freaking good. But he is not a vibes guy. He is an asshole. And he's the closest thing, and I'm not just trying to gas up Inspired because I think this does come with drawbacks, but he's like I'll couch this. He's the NALCS version of Michael Jordan, where he is not he is not your traditionally good teammate, but he is going to make you better if you listen to him. Most of the time. Like, he will boss you around and he will tell you what to do and he will flame you, but 90% of the time he's going to be right. But that 10% of the time where he's wrong and he's flaming you for something that he's wrong about, that's so hard to stomach. So over time, I think that just deteriorates relationships. And I'm just so curious. I am so curious how Inspired Caps would work. Because Caps is the GOAT. Like, he is the Western GOAT. I know people were saying, like, oh, maybe Inspired, blah, blah, blah. There was a time this year where I think Inspired was the best player in the West, but he is not the GOAT. Caps is. And Romain, in the pregame interview for G2's general manager, when asked, like, how has it been going from Lore? He was just saying, we are just trying to chill. A lot of times, Worlds kind of breaks teams. Like, you're losing a lot, you're arguing with each other, you're getting tired. So it's just really important to keep the vibes up. I'm paraphrasing what I heard. This is not an exact quote. And I think G2 and Romain are really conscious of culture and vibes. And I think Caps is someone who also thrives with good vibes and a positive culture. So even if Inspired is the best jungler, I don't know if their personalities mesh. So I think it's a really exciting, interesting, but dangerous pairing if you bring Caps and Inspired together. But also, like, the fact that they're both free agents, they could both switch teams. I think the entire offseason is just on hold because people are wondering where Inspired goes. And Inspired has no loyalties. He's not winning it for North America. He's not hoping to go home and win for Europe. He is hoping to be on the best team he can be and make the most money he can make. I'm not sure on the money part. But he just wants to play with whatever mid laner he thinks is best. I think he'd like to play with JoJo. I think he'd like to play with Caps. I think he'd probably like to play with Quid. But I don't know how it's going to work out. I don't think FlyQuest lets Busio go. There was the news that Whippo is not the starting top laner for FlyQuest. I think there's a chance he jungles for FlyQuest. I also think PR-wise, a lot of teams are scared of associating themselves with Whippo at the moment. So who knows how that's going to affect his free agency. Quid, I think he's probably going to TL, but you never know. He could fly over to LEC as well. Yeah. One tweak is, I know everyone's like, oh yeah, TL Inspired. Just throw the bag at Quid Inspired. That would max their imports. And I don't feel like there's a good option for them top lane since they've already decided to part ways with Impact. Even though weirdly enough, like if you were to put together that team, that TL team, Impact, Inspired, Quid, Korja, it sounds great on paper. But I just feel like they were ready to move on from Impact. They don't want to run it back next year. And also, like, I don't know. Inspired is his own culture. You have to be willing to completely buy into his style of no filter criticism. Like, he is going to, if he thinks you messed up, he's going to talk about it to you, to the public, to anyone who asks him the question. And you just have to be ready for that. But he is great. So I'm sorry, G2 fans, that I just incepted into your mind that Caps could leave. But I think it's justifiable for G2 to run back the same roster. I think it's justifiable for them to try and sign Inspired, even though they've literally only given Skewmon 1 year. I'm just really excited to see what happens. Anyway, that's it for these daily thoughts from Worlds. Hope the construction noise wasn't too obnoxious. Please subscribe to the channel. Go follow Esports Chat on TikTok as well. And I will hopefully see you tomorrow for T1 versus AL.